I remember actually, funnily enough, Fred Goodwin, who unquestionably had many faults and has a lot to answer for. When it got to the point where it was clear that the government had to step in, I actually think he was one of the first bank board members to kind of get that the game was up.
Today's guest is Sir John Kingman. Sir John is Chair of Legal & General, the UK's largest institutional investor, and Chair of Barclays Bank UK.
Sort of systemic indicator of bad cultures, particularly in a bank, it is an overemphasis on top-line growth. If you're running a bank, there are always going to be an infinite number of people who will borrow money from you. If you put really severe pressure on your teams to drive top-line growth, bad things will probably happen.
Sir John had a long career at the heart of government as second permanent secretary to the UK Treasury, where he was closely involved in the UK's response to the financial crisis. In 2018, he led the landmark independent review of the Financial Reporting Council, the Kingman Review, which called for the abolition of the FRC and its replacement with a new statutory regulator.
The question I always ask, certainly of anyone who's ever been on a board, is can you tell me about when you've kind of changed the weather on something and made a difference? If you haven't made a difference to something, you're not a good use of a board seat.
Welcome to Enter the Boardroom, the podcast for boards and board members. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Neural, home to the Enter the Boardroom community, the destination for serving and aspiring board directors. Sir John, welcome to Enter the Boardroom.
Thank you for having me.
Can we start by talking about your executive experience? You personally handled the Northern Rock resolution and led the £37 billion recapitalisation negotiations with RBS, Lloyds and HBOS. And you watched boards face extinction in real time in that moment. And most directors will never face a situation of nationalisation like that, but they will face moments when the company's survival is in doubt. Be really interested to hear what patterns of board behaviour did you see under pressure that might be instructive for board members listening.
So you're right to say these were very extreme circumstances we were dealing with. When banks run out of money, it's pretty stressful for people. So it's not surprising that boards come under huge pressure at that moment. And I guess you see all varieties of human behaviour. On the whole, it's better not to panic. I know that sounds like a statement of the obvious. I guess the other thing is that a sort of self-preservation instinct can set in. And I think it's really important to remember that directors have a very, very serious obligation to the company they're a director of and to put that first. And I suppose I did see some people running towards problems and some people running away from them. And I have huge respect to the people who were in the first category, but that wasn't everyone.
You said better not to panic. I guess the implication is some people did panic. And I guess there were some incredibly experienced people around those tables. What do you think it was that made some panic and others not, that a board member listening can learn from? Because I guess we'd all like to think we wouldn't panic, we'd be calm, but it's easy to say that when you're not in that situation.
I completely agree. I think it's, I mean, I don't think the panic took the form of people sort of screaming out the room or anything like that. But there were certainly people who were under such severe stress that they effectively were unable to operate. And you need to be able to operate, and the board needs to be able to operate, and needs to be able to operate very fast. So you need people who can be decisive under pressure, can remember their, I guess, responsibilities. I have huge respect for the people who really coped in those, as I say, very extreme situations.
And it sounds like they're in that classic fight or flight mode. And if I think of other walks of life, when we face fight or flight situations, what helps is if you've done training before and your reflexes kick in so that you're not having to think in that moment. Were there any common patterns that you could observe amongst those who didn't drop into that fight or flight mode?
Actually, I think the sort of, I mean, apart from just sheer stress, which is, it is what it is. It's maybe even almost a medical situation. But I guess the other thing was, I think some people were more clear-sighted than others about the depth of the hole in which we all found ourselves so quickly. And, I do think that some very senior board members in that situation kind of took time to sort of face up to the scale of, I suppose, what in a sense they felt they had presided over. And that is a really difficult thing for a human being in a very high status role. And I suppose, I did see some individuals who were just much more realistic and less in denial. I remember actually, funnily enough, Fred Goodwin, who, unquestionably had many faults and has a lot to answer for. But I do actually think when it got to the point where it was clear that the government had to step in, I actually think he was one of the first bank board members to kind of get that the game was up, if I can put it that way, that he had to face up to that, and therefore the discussions with the government were really about, of quite a practical kind, about what actions we all had to take, rather than, blustering around about it. And as I say, I actually think he was one of the first to kind of get quite how bad it was, and he sort of got past it before some of the other people we were dealing with.
Do you think those individual responses were predictable? And what I mean by that is, now as a chair, when you're looking to hire a board member, are there certain characteristics you're looking for that you think will predict someone remaining calm in a situation like that?
I'm not certain that you can build a board entirely to be ready for the collapse of the company. But if you think about some of the adjectives I've used, clear-sightedness, calm, good judgment, don't lose your head. I mean, those are things you'd want of any board member and almost any circumstance. So yes, but I think there are other things that we learned from that period. I mean, for instance, the boards we were dealing with were all enormous. The board of RBS, I think, had well over 20 people at the point at which the bank imploded. And, you just can't run a board like that, whether in conditions of stress or not, I would say. So I think we all learned things about, the design of boards that probably at the margin contributed to the crisis.
As you look back now, what were the earliest signs that the board was already in trouble, long before the crisis was obvious, that, if you're sitting on a board today, would make you think, I've seen this pattern before?
First of all, I think we should all be sort of humble about this. I mean, the fact is not many people did see the crisis coming. Some did, but very few did. And famously, regulators didn't, and central banks didn't, governments didn't, shareholders didn't, rating agencies didn't, boards didn't. So kind of, I think we should all be humble that, somehow, if we had our time again, we'd all see it coming. But to answer your question, I do think groupthink was definitely an issue. And the groupthink went beyond bank boards and included all the groups that I've just mentioned. There's no question that there was a sort of failure, a massive collective failure of imagination to imagine, in particular, that a whole bunch of assets that were very highly rated would turn out to be worthless. So groupthink is an obvious danger signal. I do think, I made the point about the size of boards not helping. I think the other thing that I do think is very dangerous in financial institutions is a bad culture. And so people talk about culture and it sounds like it's a kind of fluffy thing. Culture, I actually don't think it is a fluffy thing. I think it's actually quite a hard-edged thing. And if I had to, put my finger on the thing that was a sort of systemic indicator of bad cultures, it's particularly in a bank, it is an overemphasis on top line growth. Now, all businesses need to grow and they need to be successful. But banks are particularly dangerous things because, if you are selling toothpaste, some people want to buy your toothpaste, some people don't. You have to persuade people to buy your toothpaste. That's all fine. If you're running a bank, there are always going to be an infinite number of people who will borrow money from you. So creating top line growth in a bank is not hard, right? And if you put really severe pressure on your teams to drive top line growth, bad things will probably happen, particularly if you link their pay to that. And, if I step back and look at the institutions that blew up in the crisis, in each one you can analyze very carefully the asset mix and what it was that went wrong. But I think this overemphasis on top line growth in a bank is a very strong danger signal.
One of the things that really interested me in your Kingman review was that you recognize that actually having a system where businesses don't blow up is not actually a desirable outcome, that's a healthy thing to happen, which in my mind is a function of risk and risk tolerance. And I suppose it's for a board member, it's distinguishing between what are the risks that we are comfortable taking and recognizing they could play out and we could blow up on the back of them versus what are the avoidable failures. I guess there's a difference between an intelligence failure and an intelligent failure and an avoidable failure, to use the language Amy Edmondson used in episode 100. So how do you think about that risk and what risks you're willing to take now as a board member for blow-ups versus those that you're not?
So you're completely right that all businesses have to take risk. Financial institutions for sure have to take risk. That's what they do. That's what their business is. So do insurers. So it's all about the management of risk. When I say the management of risk, that means understanding when you hypothesize a set of scenarios and say to yourself, would we survive them? That's what stress testing is. And then you do something which was a clear lesson learned from the crisis, which was reverse stress testing. When you say to yourself, let's take the institution to the point of failure and work back and say to ourselves, what are the set of things that need to have gone wrong to get you to that point? All of which should be telling you, are we managing this institution in a way that is going to, in any set of imaginable, we'll come back to the word imaginable, in any set of imaginable circumstances, will this institution continue to exist, service its customers and deliver decent returns to its shareholders? And I do think the disciplines that are now required of all financial institutions post-crisis to go through those exercises are a really healthy thing. Now, some of that architecture existed before the crisis. So you've got to say to yourself, well, clearly it failed. Now, why did it fail? Answer, because there was a failure to imagine how bad the circumstances could be. And actually, when we went back and looked at the stress testing that the banks had done pre-crisis, they had gone through the exercises as they were required to do. But actually, it turned out that the stresses that they had imagined were really quite mild. And so I come back to this phrase I used earlier about a sort of collective failure of imagination. You've got to really seriously be able to imagine things that might seem a little bit outlandish. Now, I think financial institutions do that. I sit on the risk committee of Barclays. I attend the risk committee of Legal & General. So, and we spend a lot of time imagining and trying to ask ourselves the question, and hence the importance of avoiding groupthink, because you need board members to say, well, hang on a moment. And I'll give you an example. A question that was debated on one of those committees was, are we right to think of US Treasury bonds as essentially risk-free? Maybe they aren't. I think it's a very good discipline to ask yourself those sorts of questions.
What are the other, I guess, assumptions that most people are making that you find yourself questioning now in those sorts of discussions?
I think it's hard to generalize about that, but essentially, I think a very good discipline is to try and understand the assumptions that investors are sort of coalescing around, and say to yourself, well, just what if they're wrong? What if they're wrong? So the assumptions that are implicit in market valuations of particular assets or whatever, and you need to have people both on the kind of non-exec, the committees and boards, and in the exec, particularly in the second line, who have the sort of habit of mind that is inclined to say the herd might be wrong about this. I think the best book about the crisis by a mile, there are lots of books about the crisis. The best book by a mile is Michael Lewis's book, The Big Short, which was made into a film. And you've probably read it, but essentially what Michael Lewis did was he went and found some people who had genuinely seen the crisis coming. And he did find some people he had to look quite hard, but he found some people who had seen the crisis coming, some of whom had made an enormous amount of money out of correctly foreseeing the crisis, hence The Big Short. But the real point of the book, which I think is interesting, is that these proved to be extremely odd people. They were people who thought in a weird way. And it's a bit like Dominic Cummings's, whatever it is, Misfits and whatever. And banks, which are kind of big bureaucracies, don't necessarily employ weird misfits, but you need people who do think in a contrarian way to do this well.
So that's interesting. So for board members listening in chairs, particularly thinking more consciously about, have I got enough misfits around this table who are really going to...
Absolutely. Lots of weirdos on boards, definitely.
Can we move on to talk about the Kingman review that you...
I hate people calling it the Kingman review, but anyway.
What would you like me to call it?
It was a review of the FRC, but anyway, keep going.
So I'd love to... For those not familiar with it, you were looking at what's wrong with corporate governance and audit oversight, and you found that the FRC had become what you called ramshackle, a body that looked robust on paper but was hollow in practice. Now, every board relies on assurance systems that might have the same problem. So interested to hear you think, and would advise a board member listening to this to tell the difference between genuine oversight and governance theatre.
I mean, actually, so just to touch on the FRC work for a second, I actually don't think it was quite like that. I mean, the FRC was not, at the time I was asked to review it, the reason I was asked to review it was actually there'd been a build-up of criticism of the FRC from the outside for actually years. So I'm afraid it wasn't a situation that the FRC was this very respected organisation and then I was set into and discovered that it was rotten to the core. Actually, in a funny way, my review kind of wrote itself because it was reasonably clear, I think, to observers of that world what the weaknesses of the FRC were, and I think it wasn't very difficult to make a set of recommendations that could get it to a better place. And by the way, I think the FRC have done a huge job under very strong leadership to get themselves to a better place following that review. So I don't think I sort of spotted a whole bunch of stuff that others didn't spot. So the interesting question then, which may have wider relevance, is why did that kind of movement for reform and reshaping not come from within the FRC? And the FRC had a board and distinguished people that chaired that board and so on. And I think the answer to that is slightly unsatisfactory, which was this was not a sort of strong regulator that had gone wrong. It was a body that had emerged from frankly a different age, where these things were done in a more clubby way, and there was a tradition of self-regulation, and there's a sort of certain assumption that good chaps would do the right thing, and it could all be done quite informally. And the lesson of numerous things that have blown up around the FRC was that actually that wasn't working. But the FRC was quite slow to sort of face up to that and to ask themselves, how could we change this? It was easier for me coming in from the outside with a clear remit to ask those fundamental questions in a way than it was for those inside the organization. But I do think the organization could actually, in a different sort of, had things played out differently and my review never existed, the organization could perfectly well have come to government and said, you know what, we need to strengthen this organization, and for that we're going to need a whole set of new tools to do the job. So I guess, that is a lesson for any organization. Now, I actually think it's harder for take a listed company to get itself into that sort of mess where it's sort of, it's a bit the sort of boiled frog. And the reason it's harder is because listed companies are subjected to market disciplines that public institutions aren't. So in the end, shareholders will kick up a fuss if a company's not well run. And ultimately, if investors don't, then someone will come along and take it over and shake it up. And that doesn't happen to public institutions in the same way. And so, in a way, I was given the remit to be the activist investor or whatever who calls this out for the FRC.
There's a window in a board career that most people don't know about. If you don't start to add board roles to your CV in the first 2 years, you risk falling into a grey zone. No longer seen as emerging talent, but not yet established enough to be sought after. The clock is running. The Enter the Boardroom community helps you build momentum now, sharpening your proposition, growing your network, and keeping your knowledge current. Visit etb.newroll.com to find out more. Hugh, there's a role, just listening to you there, is there a role for a misfits subcommittee whose sole job it is to challenge the current board on its direction of travel and to act as a permanent devil's advocate? Or do you think that would be too disruptive?
I don't think you necessarily need a sort of red team, but I do think that boards should ask themselves that question the whole time. They should ask themselves, we may think we're doing a jolly good job, but do our shareholders think that? Are we, if we compare ourselves really honestly against, the best international competition or whatever? I think it's a crucial, in a way, the most fundamental role of a board is to ask themselves that question. Boards are not there to sort of crank the handle on a beautiful process. They're there to ask, to be the stewards of the company and to be the best stewards they can be. They've got to be asking themselves those challenging and difficult questions, and that's why they're non-executive. The idea is it's always going to be hard for the execs to be wholly objective. The non-execs have no excuse not to be objective. Actually, they're non-executives. That's the point. And it's why things like, I'm currently timing out at LNG because I've done my 9 years. I actually am a supporter of the 9-year rule, even though I'm sorry to be leaving LNG, because I do think that, you become the boiled frog if you're not careful. It inevitably becomes harder over time. I hope I haven't become immune to objectivity, but I think it is a sensible discipline for there to be turnover of non-executives so that you get that continual challenge.
Before we go on to the lightning round, I want to quickly pick your brains as a chair. Curious to hear, when you look around your board tables, what distinguishes your very best non-executives?
Great question. I think the sort of biggest knack of being a non-exec is this thing about being able to bring intelligent, helpful challenge in a way that is sort of fearless, because you need to be fearless, but kind of is done in the right way. It's the opposite of scoring cheap points. You need the execs to feel that you're fundamentally sympathetic to what we're all trying to do, to understand the challenges they face, but nevertheless to be really challenging and ambitious. And that striking that balance and doing it in the right way is what this is all about. And you kind of know it when you see it, but I think non-execs can learn from watching other non-execs do it. And some of this is actually about, some of this is for sure about substance. So if you don't understand the business, then honestly, you shouldn't be there. And so you have to have made the effort to understand the business, or else the execs will rightly sort of roll their eyes about you, and they should. But then you need to do it in the right way, and that is a bit of a knack. And some people get it, and some people don't. But I do think it can be learned.
Can you give me an example of where a non-exec has changed your mind as a chair or the board's direction effectively?
I'm not sure. I mean, there are lots of colleagues that I've worked with on boards who've changed my mind or changed the company's mind, and I actually think, I'm not going to give examples, but I do think that is, when I'm interviewing non-execs, potential non-execs, the question I always ask, certainly if anyone who's ever been on a board, is, can you tell me about when you've kind of changed the weather on something and made a difference? And honestly, if they don't have a good answer to that question and they've sat on a board, then I really question whether they're the right people to have, because that is what you're there for. It goes back to this thing I said earlier. You're not there to crank the handle on a process. You are there to contribute, and if you haven't made a difference to something, you're not a good use of a board seat, to put it harshly.
So that's one question you asked. How have they changed the weather? What are the other questions? If you were interviewing our listeners today for a board role, and you could ask them just 3 questions, so 2 more besides that one, what would you ask them, and what would you be looking for in a good response?
I would certainly ask them a question designed to get a sense of their judgment about people. I do think, the boards are there to think about a whole range of issues, but a lot of the really big decisions come down to people. Most importantly, the choice of chief executive. And so I do think good people judgment is a sort of hard requirement for a board member, and therefore digging into their experience to try and get a sense of, are they a good judge of people? Or do they have high standards when it comes to thinking about judgments about people? For example, it can be interesting to ask them about, we've all made mistakes on people. There's no one who's never made a mistake on an appointment. And I think one of the most interesting things is whether people learn from mistakes. Because we all have usually mistakes about people stem from biases we have. And whether people have thought about their own biases about people is a really interesting thing to explore. And then I would try and get a sense, I suppose, you asked for 3. The third would be something to get a sense of whether they can cope under severe pressure in a crisis. So just getting them to tell war stories about things they've had to deal with is usually enlightening.
You talked about how your best non-execs are good at effectively challenging in a sportive way in the boardroom. Is there anything that you think they do between meetings that others don't, that makes them stand out?
Definitely. So I think being a good board member definitely usually involves doing things outside the boards. I think if I think around the best non-execs I work with, and also which I think correlates to some extent to, whether they actually enjoy it as well, they tend to have found some way into the business outside the boardroom. And it can take the form of mentoring people, mentoring execs. It can take the form of taking a bit of the business sort of slightly under their wing and being a bit of a sounding board for the team running that bit of the business. It can take the form, I have a board member at L&G who's quite involved in some commercial negotiations we've done because, they happen to be very experienced at doing that. As I say, I think that makes the board role massively more enjoyable for the non-exec. I think it also gives non-execs a kind of a better window on the organization than they can get for any amount of sitting through PowerPoint. And I also think that it creates a good dynamic with the execs if they can see that someone's adding value. Now, obviously, engagement that doesn't add value is not ideal. So it needs to be real and additive and not for the sake of it. But in my experience, that's not hard to see, and I see lots of examples of that happening.
In episode 19, we had Owen Eastwood talking about the importance of creating belonging in high-performing teams. If you have a new NED joining one of your boards tomorrow, what are you talking to them about in your first one-to-one that a chair listening can learn from, or someone who's about to join a board?
I think the main thing I would say to people, in that situation is, don't lose your first impressions. Before you become the boiled frog, actually, trust your instincts. If something strikes you as odd, feel free to say so. It's not, and the observation might not turn out to be a good one, but that's absolutely fine. And so just trying to get people, another way of putting it is, it's fine to ask silly questions. Don't be embarrassed. It's not, you're not on a show. You're not here to it's not an exam. We're not going to mark your contribution. And actually, people's first reactions to things are often very revealing. They often force conversations about things that we should be having conversations about, or they are, they prompt a board to think differently about something. So just kind of telling people to be willing to almost sort of bottle up their first reactions and make sure we don't waste them is the main thing.
It's interesting because at the start of this conversation, you told me not to call you Sir John, which actually is a wonderful way of creating a sort of safe space. Is that something, because I can imagine in years gone by, you would have had Sir or Lady this or whatever it was that would have created an intimidation factor. That's
and actually when I showed up at LNG, everyone tried to call me chairman, and I wasn't having that either. It's just ridiculous. No, it is slightly awkward, but I always tell people not to do it. It's very nice of people to do it, but
Time has flown, which means it's time for the lightning round, where I'm going to ask you a short question and ask you for a quick response if you're ready.
Yep.
Best book every board member should read, and why?
I think I've told you that the best financial book, The Big Short, for the reasons I gave.
Boardroom behaviour that irritates you most?
I personally dislike the sort of non-exec who feels they need to ask a question on every item in order to be seen to be engaged and, doing their job properly. I don't want to discourage anyone from asking anything they want to ask, but questions for the sake of questions can be a bit wearing for everyone. Yeah.
Less is more. A question every board should ask at least once a year.
Are we actually adding any value? Are we making a positive difference as a board? It's not enough just to be here. It's the crank the handle point. Can we put our finger on something and say, we prompted something to happen that wasn't otherwise happening or whatever, but somehow actually demonstrably adding value.
What's a boardroom myth you think needs busting?
I'd come back to the sort of the tyranny of the skills matrix. I just think that it's not a myth. Because it's not valueless. But I think if you allow yourself to shape the board around a sort of spreadsheet, you won't in the end end up with the optional board.
Art, not science. Favorite quote?
Well, it's not terribly relevant to our conversation, but I worked for Gordon Brown for a long time, and he loved to quote a man called Jimmy Maxton that he actually wrote a biography of. And Jimmy Maxton apparently said, if you can't ride two horses at once, you shouldn't be in the circus. And I've always thought that's a good one.
A piece of board advice that sounds right but is wrong.
Maybe I'd go back to this thing about board members feeling they've got to say something on every item in order to sort of earn their keep. I judge board members by what value they add in a round. And I certainly have worked with board members who've been silent on quite a lot of items, but actually add a ton of value, in certain situations or when they do speak, they've really got something to say. Some of the most effective board members I work with if you were to draw a sort of pie chart of who's taking the airtime at the board, they wouldn't have a terribly big slice, but when they do speak, it really counts. And that's the most important thing.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time, and how has that changed how you behave as a board member?
So I was quite involved in government in the work of the Derek Higgs review, which sort of led to the combined code in its current form. And I do agree with most of the things in that review. I do think that this goes back a little bit to your Employer Explain point earlier. I think that the strictures of the combined code work best for established businesses and are probably not very well suited to the most sort of entrepreneurial and fast-changing businesses with kind of strong founders. And I do think, when there's this debate about the UK as a place for, those sorts of businesses to thrive and grow and scale up, I do think there's not enough flexibility in we pride ourselves on having a fantastic corporate governance regime, and I would not want to do away with that. And as you rightly say, LNG is a big policeman of that. But I think there just needs to be a bit more horses for courses. And I would apply different governance standards to different kinds of businesses at different stages of life. And the best way to make that happen is just to make Employer Explain much more real. And so I have my views on that have evolved. I used to be more of a kind of strict governance person.
It's interesting how the airline industry, say, has never really had people saying we need less regulation because, it keeps people alive and safe when they're flying, and yet somehow something seems to have gone slightly wrong with how we get that balance right of keeping people safe while still letting people fly.
Yeah, and there's a fundamental paradox in the fact that you could argue the UK has the best governance standards in the world, but it certainly doesn't have the best businesses in the world. Britain's a low productivity economy. We don't have that many stunning world-class businesses, and so we should be willing to ask ourselves questions about that disconnect.
When was the last time you got a significant judgment call wrong in the boardroom, and what did you learn? I
think most of the mistakes that I've made have been about people. That's probably true of all of us. For the avoidance of doubt, I'm very, very happy with all the choices I've made about chief executive appointments. But no, I think people judgments are the hardest, really. The only other sort of board related thing that I would say is I've certainly experienced situations where, with the benefit of hindsight, there have been things that the executive have been attached to doing, and the board could have stepped in sooner and said, look, is this really working? I think boards can be a little bit slow to do that, partly because there's a sort of understandable feeling we're not actually here to try and run the company ourselves. And we should, if we've hired these execs, we should generally back them. But there's inevitably, there are things that execs try and become very committed to. And part of the role of the board is to say, look, honestly, is this quite working? And boards do that, and I've done that, and that's fine. And it's part of the nature of the thing. But in my experience, boards tend to come to that quite a bit more slowly than perhaps they should.
And finally, 3 things our listeners should take away from this episode if they take nothing else.
I'm not sure I've got 3, but I'll give you a few. So the groupthink thing is very, very, very important. To be highly suspicious of groupthink as a board member. Don't let the computer take over when it comes to constructing your board, and just be really obsessed about people. Really, really, the most important decisions are usually about people. Who to appoint, who to trust, who to fire, and getting those ones right are the most important decisions that boards take in general.
John, thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom and experience.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
If you want to avoid the stall that quietly catches so many board careers, the Enter the Boardroom community gives you the peer environment and structure to keep building. Listeners get 10% off. Visit etb.newroll.com and use the code ENTER at checkout.